Hello and welcome to the Headache Doctor podcast, where on this podcast, it's our mission to educate and empower everyone with headaches and migraines so that you can break free from a life of fear of your next headache or migraine and dependence on medication. In this podcast, we're going to talk about how to evaluate your day to understand what may have caused your headache or migraine. And we have Dr. Sarah Thomas with us again. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here. I love doing podcasts.
All right. So, Dr. Thomas, now this came out of a desire to set up a headache journal. Tell us how this kind of organically came to be, interacting with patients and then seeing the need.
Yeah, I found with my patients, headaches are really, really frustrating. They kind of a lot of times seem to come out of nowhere with no rhyme or reason. So people, they might wake up with them. It might come on later in the day. And there might be a pattern, but it's really hard sometimes to pick up on it. And I think this can be a really great source of frustration for people. You know, you've got this pain and it can be to the point it's debilitating. You know, you're calling off work, you're not able to care for kids, that sort of thing. And you don't know why it's happening. And I think that's just the kind of the source of such a lack of control. And the reality is, like I said, there is a pattern for it. And it can be something that is, you know, pretty simple to figure out when you know what to look for. So for example, I was working with a patient a few weeks ago and she came in and she'd been doing pretty good. And then she'd had kind of a migraine attack and it felt like it was out of nowhere. And we started talking because then I was like, okay, let's backtrack. Let's see what happened in, you know, maybe the day leading up to it. And she was like, well, yeah, the day before my friend had been moving. So she had been bent over in a really, you know, a pretty strenuous position for the neck for hours. I can't remember if she was picking up boxes or cleaning, but something along that line. And then they'd had a party that night to celebrate the friend. And she'd had, I think, multiple pieces of either cake or pie or some sort of dessert. And then the next day she had a really severe migraine attack. And I was able to backtrack and be like, okay, you know, we put a lot of stress on the neck. We ate a food that usually lowers your threshold, increases your inflammation. And I was like, okay, pretty easy to figure out. And that was so liberating for her because then she's not worried about, you know, oh my gosh, they're coming back. It's the end. You know, it's just like, oh, I did a couple things that triggered my headaches. And it's as simple as that. And it's a huge weight off people's shoulders. So I wanted to teach people today kind of about that, what they can be looking at throughout the day.
Yeah. And I see that as well. People, it's a practice that we go through, especially when you get to a portion of your plan of care where you've seen some relief and you're starting to see headache-free days, and then maybe you have a setback, maybe something pops up and you have a migraine. It wasn't necessarily expected or whatever it may be. But it doesn't have to be for someone going through a plan of care. Anyone can evaluate their day or maybe even the day before and understand, basically make a checklist of the things that maybe were helpful, maybe that were leading to the migraine. And you can use that information to then change your situation and not feel so helpless, reactive, potentially not relying on medication as much either. And so if we can take someone through this process of sort of a snapshot of the questions we would ask them when they have a migraine, just to evaluate, okay, what are the factors? Let's try to make sense of it. Sometimes we can't control everything. But a lot of the stuff we can, and when we start to understand it, we get really valuable information. And so, yeah, let's dive into that.
Yeah. So our first thing that I want to evaluate, and this is a little bit more of like a journal focus, but just noting the date and then the day of the week. I've actually found with a lot of my patients, their headaches are kind of have a bit of a daily presentation. So for example, I have someone I've worked with that her headaches always come on either Monday or Tuesday. So we can look at that. Sometimes people get worse headaches on the weekends. A lot of times weekends might be a little bit, you know, freer. You might be a little more active. So you might get less headaches on the weekends. But the first thing is just to be aware of the day and even the date as well. So that's thing number one.
Yeah. And that's important too, because one day can have a cumulative effect. And then certain activities can sort of bleed over or overflow into the next day. And so understanding that some of these triggers or some of the things that impact your situation aren't necessarily specific to a day. So it is helpful to keep track of each day and what it looks like. But then looking at the big picture and what, you know, that time of the year was like, pressure, all sorts of stuff. So yeah, having the data to look back to is important.
Yeah, and one quick note here too is that you do want to be tracking even the days you don't have a headache because, like Dr. Taves said, if your headaches come on, say, on a Friday, it may not be that something happened just on that Friday. It may be the work stress that led up to, Monday through Thursday may be leading up. So if your stress level, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, if your stress level was like 10 out of 10 for 4 days straight, that may be the reason you get those headaches. So it is important to be tracking not only the days you have headaches, but the days you don't to see what's going on.
All right. So, yeah, what else, as someone gets to the end of the day, what are some other things that people should be thinking about?
Yeah. So my next, again, and I kind of arranged these in sections. We actually are kind of developing a headache journal. So these are in my brain kind of organized in sections. So the next section or the next kind of pattern to think about is just your headache itself. So did you have a headache today? What was the presentation? Was it on one side? What was, was it kind of wrapping around the head? Was it more in the temple? When did it come on? So did you wake up with that headache? Did it come on by like 4 p.m.? Did you go to bed with it? Did it go away? And if so, what time? So kind of more general headache symptoms. A lot of times too, you can look at other symptoms that go along with the headache. So aura, dizziness, nausea, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So the way the headache presents is important because, like in our world, it relates back to potentially the same side of the body that has a problem. So that's one that's easy for people to connect to. Right-sided head pain sometimes can mean the right side of the neck, the right shoulder. It's not always true, but generally it follows pattern of the same side. And then how the symptoms present, the intensity of them. Was it low grade? Was it sharp stabbing, dull, achy? Those can indicate, again, different types of tissues that are irritated. I've got a previous podcast on that. Understanding the source of your pain, I believe is what it's called. But the information that we get from the pain itself, and sometimes it's not even pain, it's just like the aura, brain fog, stuff like that, can be super helpful. So definitely something to track.
Yeah. And also going along with that headache is, it's not always really obvious what causes it. And we'll get into that in the next section, is kind of the triggers you can start watching out for that may not be as obvious. But sometimes there is a really distinct trigger. So for example, like the weather changes, it happens all the time here in Colorado. So if there's a pressure change and you suddenly have a headache, if you suddenly go from low to high altitude and get a headache, you drink a glass of red wine or eat some chocolate and have a headache. So just if there is any sort of an obvious trigger, another one that can be really helpful, is just like hormones. So where are you in your cycle? Do you think it's hormonally related? All those can be really helpful if there is some sort of an obvious trigger to your headache.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's probably a level of, I think most people we interact with are relatively aware of, especially like alcohol and chocolate, those food triggers. Sometimes those are like immediate. Hormones, yeah, if they're predictable and regular cycle, then you can kind of predict. So yeah, some of those things should be like relatively easy to track, and but definitely helpful having like a journal to write it down, because sometimes we forget, and they have a cumulative effect too. So you could be someone that you have chocolate and sometimes it triggers it, and other times it doesn't. And so we want to look at the big picture. And if we don't track it, then we don't necessarily have all the data, and it might be confusing. We have people all the time that say, sometimes it feels like certain foods are a trigger and other times they're not. And it could be just where's your body at and what's the environment and what's your threshold when you consume whatever food that is. And sometimes it could be fine, and other times you could be kind of in a vulnerable state. So yeah,
I think so. Exactly. And kind of going along with that too, is these two last ones are pretty helpful. Not as much on their own, but just for tracking purposes. So, we can talk about progress a little bit right now. As you track these things, sometimes it can be a little bit hard to see, any changes or progress. So 2 factors that I like to keep an eye on are the level of pain, 0 to 10. And I do want to say everyone hates that pain scale. It's very common that, I'll give that pain scale and everyone's like, oh, I hate that. I don't know how to answer. And it's important to remember you're comparing yourself to you, not other people. So yes, it's pretty well understood that like someone's 5 is someone else's 10, someone's 1 is someone else's 8, and that's fine. It's it's to compare you to you. So if you're always rating yourself, you're always comparing yourself, you're able to track that pain level. And you can see, as the months go on and you get a little bit better at predicting triggers, you can say, okay, my headaches used to be kind of a 6 out of 10 on average, and now they're down to more of a 3. So that can be really helpful just as from a tracking standpoint. And the other thing that's really interesting and can be useful to track is medications taken. So when that headache comes on, do you need like a triptan? Do you need a CGRP? Do you need a more extensive kind of prescription medication to manage it? Or are you able to manage it with like Advil or Tylenol, that sort of thing? And that can be useful because a lot of times with my patients, what I'll see is that they initially have to take prescription medications to manage. And as their headaches get better, as their sensitivity drops, suddenly they can manage with a much kind of lower over-the-counter pain medication. So both of those can be helpful to look at as well.
Yeah, the pain scale thing is definitely true with people. They get asked that a lot, right? Like, can you rate your pain? Another helpful way to look at it is your ability to function and how that's impacted. So if we're looking at someone who's maybe like 7, 8, 9, that's a substantial impact on your life. And so if you're hovering around a 7, 8, 9, you're probably calling off work. You're probably seeing a significant impact in your ability to work efficiently and effectively. You're probably canceling social events. Anything that you have the option to, you're probably sort of backing out of. And then 10 would be 9 or 10 is like you're in bed, dark room, lights off, no noise. Like generally people are just unable to function. Like you feel like you just have to go sleep. And that is for sure like calling off work. So if you have days where you just can't function at all, I would say that is a 10. Like so we look at this scale more as how debilitating are these symptoms. If we go 5, 6, 4, 5, 6, somewhere in there, that is usually your personality might be changed. It's probably going to be pretty distracting. So you're doing everything you want, but the pain is in the background and people notice in certain ways, like you're easily agitated and shorter tempered. It's probably, again, impacting social settings and your ability to tolerate prolonged outings or loud noises or settings that aren't controlled is limited. And then if we're in the 2, 3, 4 range, somewhere in there, that's going to be, again, it's probably a sense of like distraction. If we're closer to the 1, 2 range, maybe it's you have to stop and think about it so you can distract yourself, you can entertain yourself in some way, or focus on work, focus on an activity, and you don't necessarily realize you have a headache, but as soon as you stop and think about it, it's there. That would be like the 1, 2, maybe into the 3 range. And so you can look at it as a scale of disability and evaluate it that way as well. And sometimes I find that to be more helpful for people because it's less subjective. Well, it is subjective, but it's less like subjective in the sense of you're not just saying a number, you're saying what you actually feel. And usually what people feel is pretty consistent from person to person. And that can be changed by like patients' thresholds and stuff. But usually if the pain is bad enough where you're in bed, that might be different than someone else's pain level to put them in bed. But either way, it's a 10 because it's telling us like it's debilitating. Yeah.
I like that. That's actually a good way to think about it.
Yeah. And then medication use as well. Usually people track that. I mean, if it's like a triptan or something, they only get a certain number. Mm-hmm. So they're very aware. But usually it's where people are taking the ibuprofen or Tylenol, Advil. It just sort of gets away from them. And you ask them how many they take, and they're like, I don't know, like 2 a day, for like a year. We can get into a state where we're just people generally know that that's having a negative impact, but because these are so easy access, like we usually look at them as relatively harmless, especially if they're providing some benefit. I'm not saying we as providers do. We want people to get off of them, but those can be things like we don't track as well, is what I'm saying. So like a journal like this would be helpful.
Right. Okay, so that's kind of the section dealing with more of the headache. The last section then, so again, as we talked about a minute ago, some of the triggers are very obvious, but many of the triggers really aren't. And this is, to me, this is kind of the bread and butter of the headache journal or of the daily tracking, is kind of figuring out what your pattern is and what these triggers are. And these, again, are the ones that may not be as much, as obvious. And we can talk about each of them briefly. Most of them have whole episodes of podcasts dedicated to them because they are really kind of obvious or kind of not obvious things that you can be doing that can bring on headaches. So the first one in this section is diet. Now, I don't think you necessarily need to be tracking like every morsel of food that goes in your mouth, but it is a good idea day to day to look at just kind of what you're generally consuming, especially focusing on kind of the big inflammatory foods like gluten, dairy, alcohol, that sort of thing. If you're able to track that and kind of keep an eye on it. Oh, sugar's the other one. I was like, there's one more I was thinking about. Sugar is another big one. So if you're able to look and see kind of what your day-to-day diet pattern is, you're able to kind of see what your general kind of inflammatory level is, but then also you're able to track changes. Like that patient I talked about didn't usually consume cake or pie. And so suddenly it was kind of, it was a big change for her. And that was something that was very triggering for her migraines. So it's one of those things that at the end of the day, it's pretty good to look at what you are eating in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's part of the big picture. It's part of the general health, the systemic side of our 3-spoke framework. And so, and food is oftentimes people's perception of their diet is usually all over the place. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people will say my diet's fine and it's just because they don't eat fast food. And then there's other people that, if like some people are okay with soda, they don't see that as a bad thing. Other people are so detailed in what they eat. They've clearly spent a lot of time thinking about it. So anyways, it's helpful to just kind of write it down. That way we're able to track it. And
more objectively too. And I will say that is one that can be a bit touchy, especially I feel like women get kind of like, oh, I eat very healthy. And it's like, okay, like and this is never designed as like criticism or something. It's supposed to be introspective. And I had a funny story with the, people thinking their diet. I had a patient I was with that she said, well, our diet is kind of okay. And then she proceeded to be like, and we go to organic, farmers markets and this. And I'm like, what in the world is like not okay with this diet? And she was like that too, where she was very health conscious and, there was a couple of things that she ate that she was like, well, that's not as good. And it was kind of funny to me that I was like, wow, that sounds way healthier than I eat if you're getting all organic food. So yeah, I think that can be a bit of a subjective one, but it's good to just, if you can back off and, take all the emotion out of it and just look at it as food, what are you taking in day to day? The next one is this one. It sounds like a lot, but I think it can be done pretty easily, is at the end of the day, just kind of estimate the number of hours. And again, it doesn't have to be like the hours and minutes you spent in this activity. You don't need to be going through your day with a stopwatch, but estimate the number of hours you spent sitting, standing, like moving, so walking, exercising, that sort of thing, driving, and laying down. We've talked about a lot of different things that people do day to day, and especially the two big ones that are really important to keep an eye on are how long you're sitting and how long you're driving, because we've talked about, you tend to be in more of that forward position when you are driving, when you're sitting, and that tends to put a lot of stress on your neck. So tracking your sitting can be a really valuable thing to do, not even just for your headache, but for your general health as well.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a huge one. And again, an area that people will overlook. And I think there's a group of people that are more aware of their health and the amount of movement they're getting, and they'll exercise regularly, but they still spend a large portion of their day sitting. And so, I mean, obviously exercising is going to be helpful in this process and there's benefits to it, but it's the rhythm of the day and the ratios of the percentages and how much of these sedentary positions we're sustaining throughout the day. That really is important. And so for some people, yeah, like they're fit, they're healthy, they're at a good weight, they're eating well, but they're still, at a desk job sitting 8 hours, even though they get their workout in. And so we need to figure out the balance and the rhythm. And so jotting down like how much time they're spending is important.
Yeah, and it can be pretty eye-opening, and depending on your job, it can be a pretty easy one to fix too. And you look at like, okay, I sat for 8 hours today, maybe it's time to get a standing desk and at least try and substitute in. I think we've even talked about, even an hour a day can substantially reduce back and neck pain. Going along with that too is exercise is another really important one. We kind of get both sides of exercise in here, depending on what people are doing. We do get people that exercise is very alleviating. It helps the headache quite a bit. And then we also do get people that, depending, especially if they're doing like an upper body workout or running and like bobbing their head up and down a lot, we do tend to get people that exercise is really aggravating. So one thing to look at is if you exercised, yes or no, and then what you did for how long, and then if it was aggravating or not. And that can start to help. I've had people that running is very triggering for them. I've had people that, they'll do, I think you were just talking about this earlier. Bar is another one. Like bar workouts can be really triggering. And so looking at what might be leading to those headaches or alleviating them is pretty helpful from an exercise standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah. If there can be some pretty hardcore bar people out there, so
they might come after me.
Yeah. There's just we've said this before, but exercise is great. There's tons of benefits. We recommend it to all our patients. Oftentimes shoulders, neck are not in a position to tolerate the amount of added stress that's placed on them with certain types of exercise. And so it's conditioning these areas, dialing back the exercise potentially, and then providing like a specific, approach to build that up again. But being aware of that as an issue is the first step. And that's even like, if someone comes in here, we don't just assume that their exercise is a negative. We ask them to pay attention to it. What does your body tell you? And so some of this stuff, is evaluated by yourself at home, just like it would be with us here. So there's not a lot of extra that we're doing. We're just receiving the information from you and then using that data to then help guide you. So the headache journal for exercise is going to be fantastic. Yeah.
And again, our goal is not to have you stop exercising if your exercise program is seeming like it's aggravating. Yeah. The goal is not to give up exercise entirely, which we do have happen sometimes where people will be like, well, I do this and it gives me a headache, so I've stopped moving entirely. And it's like, no, that's not what we want. But we want to maybe look at again, what are we doing? And maybe how could we modify it? How could we take the neck out of the equation? How could we, if it's really upper body, like heavy work that's triggering it, maybe if we could switch to something else or switch to lighter weights. It's not so much that we want to get rid of it as we maybe need to modify it or back it off for a little bit while we're trying to loosen up the neck. Your next section is another really big one. And it's sleep. So sleep is, I think most people know that you're supposed to get somewhere between 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night, depending on, your physiology and what you need. I think it's one that many people struggle to get enough sleep, but it's not only the sleep itself. It's also the quality of sleep and the position especially are really big. So one thing I think you need to be aware of is just, how are you sleeping? Is something keeping you up? Are you not able to breathe, for example? Are you snoring really loud? And then also being aware of, if you're like a stomach sleeper, for example, we talk about extensively on this podcast, we have people that you'll tell them to stop sleeping on their stomach and their headaches reduce dramatically. I think you had one recently or on an episode of the podcast I was listening to that I think they just stopped sleeping on their stomach and their headaches went down by like 90%. It can be a potentially really big one. And we've talked pretty extensively as well about good side sleeper positions and everything. So being aware of how you sleep and in what position can be really big.
Yeah, it'd be, I don't know if I've had 90%. I think it was 50.
Okay.
But still substantial, considering that I think this individual was having 2 to 3 a week. And then when we cut it down to 1, maybe 2, that's a big deal.
It's crazy.
Considering the latest and greatest CGRP drugs basically promise half the people that try those will have 50% relief. If you sleep on your stomach and you're taking a CGRP, maybe just try stop sleeping on your stomach and you may get the same result. Maybe you can stop taking the med. I don't know. But the idea is, let's change what we can, control what we can control. And that's a good one. That's a big one.
Yeah. And it's one that really does, people don't even think about it. No one cares if you sleep on your stomach, or at least unless you've had someone tell you not to. Most people don't know. And that's one that can be huge. And again, it goes into this pattern, especially when people wake up with headaches. It just feels like it came out of nowhere, and like I was asleep. I should, my head shouldn't be hurting me when I'm asleep. And it just helps you kind of start solving this riddle of where these headaches are coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Couple more.
Okay.
We're almost there.
Yeah.
And I do want to say, this does seem like a lot. We're going through it. It takes some time. I do firmly believe you could fill this out in like 5 minutes. And I've had people write like Excel spreadsheets. Like I said, we're in the middle of developing a journal for this. I know this sounds like a lot to track. I don't actually think it would take very long, just to summarize at the end of your day. But 2 more. The last one, kind of the last headache related one, is stress level. So we do know, I think stress is usually what people blame headaches on, and it definitely can be not so much as like a cause of headaches, but it lowers your threshold. So when you're stressed, you're not able to your body's not able to ignore pain as much. Your body's going to be a lot more stressed. It's going to lower that threshold, and it's going to make you a lot more likely of having a headache. So this can be a really valuable one, not only for the day of, but like we talked about earlier, just as you're going throughout your day and your week, looking and saying, was I stressed for like the days leading up to this? I've had patients that kind of operate sort of on survival mode all week, and then Saturday crash and have a really big headache. So stress level is a really important one to be tracking.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that I think reflecting on it is helpful, because a lot of people don't realize they're stressed. I might be one of those that, so you'd have to ask me if I'm stressed, and I'd have to probably think about it. And what have I been through? And because I probably wouldn't feel it. So sometimes it's helpful to stop and think, like, what was my day like? And was my body kind of in fight or flight mode? Mm-hmm. Was I able to have that rhythm of fight or flight, rest and digest? Or was it just like always go, go, go?
Yeah. And I think a lot of us live in that go, go, go. And I think it's unfortunately becoming more and more, I find this rather distressing, that it's kind of becoming the norm to feel like you've always got to be in fight or flight. And I really disagree with that pretty strongly. That's getting into a more of a personal opinion, but it's not great for you to be in fight or flight all the time. You can survive it. It's obviously, our bodies are designed to escape from predators and, to be able to escape, but it's supposed to be short term. If you're living in a really chronically, just extremely stressful state, I kind of tell my patients it's time to look and see, are there things we could let go? Are there things we could delegate? That sort of thing. Any other comments on that?
No. What do we got?
One last thing, and this is actually, I'm going to shout out my sister Lauren. My sister Lauren is a rec therapist, and I was talking to her a couple weeks ago about this journal, and we're going to do this podcast, and I'm developing the handwritten journal. And my sister suggested that one thing that she thought people should be doing every day, and this is just kind of more of like a general mindfulness, health type of a thing, is you should be looking at one good thing that happened every day. And I really liked that. So she said that essentially it's really easy, especially when you're going through like a chronic pain situation, especially one that seems kind of out of your control and might have come out of nowhere. It can be really hard to focus on anything positive, and our brains are wired for more negative thinking than positive. Just, it's kind of a survival mechanism, but it's really easy to hijack it. And so one thing she suggested is that you just think of something. It can be a little thing, it could be like the fall leaves on the snow last week were super pretty here. So it can be something as simple as that, because when you take that moment and you remember that fun thing, be it just something funny someone said or something pretty you saw, then you kind of relive it again, and you get yourself back into that positive mindset of like, oh, I did see something beautiful. So I thought that was really powerful and something really good for chronic pain sufferers.
Yeah, I love that. I was on my way to work, and I had stopped by Walgreens, and there was the cashier, and then this gentleman in front of me, and I guess this gentleman frequents the Walgreens. It looks like he was getting his groceries, and their interaction was just like so pleasant. They knew each other on a first name basis, and he was trying to get her to keep his change. She was like, no, you can have it. And then she was telling me how sometimes kids come in and they don't have enough, and so they use it in that little jar. It's just like, I mean, to your point, it was a redeeming moment in the world of, it just made me happy. Like, I was excited to see that. And I think reflecting on, the blessings, things that we can be grateful for, is a fantastic way to end the day for sure.
Yeah. And honestly, I'm not sure that wouldn't be a bad thing for like every single one of us to do.
Yeah.
Again, you know, media tends to be a little more on the negative side. I think we're all pretty aware of that at this point. So I think even if you're not a chronic pain sufferer, even if you get like one headache a year, it probably isn't a bad thing every day to just sit down and be like, what is one good thing that happened?
All right. So this headache journal, you told me this morning that I think we're on track to have it ordered and in circulation here in Novera in December, for sure, by the new year. And so when this podcast comes out, it might be weeks away. It's something we'll try to roll into what we're doing with patients in person, and potentially the virtual coaching as well, as that would be helpful. And then I think we're going to figure out a way to sell it. So if there's people that would like to receive a headache journal to start tracking this stuff, feel free to reach out to us. You can even send us a text. So 719-598-1010 is our number. You can send a text to that number and just say headache journal, and we can put you on a list and make sure that, we give you the link to purchase when it comes out. I think this is going to be a valuable resource for people, especially our listeners in the podcast, because you all know the actionable steps that you can take to make changes. And if you have a resource like this where you can, within 5 minutes, evaluate your day, I think that's going to be super helpful. So thank you, Dr. Thomas, for...
Yeah, you're welcome. Like I said, pleasure to be here.
All right. So thank you all for listening to the Headache Doctor podcast, being faithful every week. Go ahead and subscribe to this so that you get notifications of the weekly podcast on Mondays. Share it. Write us a review. Tell us how this has impacted your life. There's been some fantastic reviews that have come through, and I'm humbled by them because they often share stories of people's lives being changed from listening to this podcast. And so, I really, really appreciate you guys taking the time to do that. And it helps this podcast grow. You are our marketing strategy. So if you can share it, like it, subscribe, leave us a 5-star review. That really helps us get the word out. We have our offices in Parker, Colorado, and then Colorado Springs, Colorado. So 2 locations. Dr. Thomas is in Parker. If you'd like to see her, visit us at our Parker office, and we would love to help you on this journey to finding headache and migraine relief. So thank you all for listening as we continue on this journey of providing, of educating, empowering everyone with headaches and migraines so that you can break free from a life of fear of your next headache or migraine and dependence on medication. We'll see you next week.